Now, what do you do with conflicts? In the old days, I suppose, you just kind of let them have it off. Just, they'd shoot each other or whatever would happen. And certainly, you know from Diamond and other readings that many times a particular group would simply roll over another group. There's a whole other approach to this that many of us think is much better, and it's called conflict resolution, or maybe we can define it more broadly as policy. Policy means we're going to decide in a civilized manner what we're going to do about whatever the resource issues or environmental issues or other issues are. And Dr. Don Floyd is here. He's from our forestry faculty, and that's his specialty. I'd also like to say that he taught this course with Dr. Burgess, who just recently passed away before I inherited this course. So he has personally a stake in this course. If you're interested in what he has to say, he'll tell you, I suppose, about the courses that he teaches. He has an undergraduate degree from Humboldt State, which in a certain way is ESF West, would that be fair? A master's from Wisconsin, and that's in California, Humboldt, and a master's from Wisconsin, and a PhD from the University of Arizona, all schools that have very fine programs in resource issues. So I welcome Dr. Floyd, and the class is yours.
Thank you, Charlie. I think it's always dangerous to clap before a speaker starts because you never know what you're going to get. Okay, so let's be careful. Let me start by making a couple comments about the idea of conflict and conflict management. Charlie said something specifically about conflict resolution. What I want to do today is I want to introduce you to the idea of conflict management, and not that you're going to resolve conflicts as environmental managers, because the major point that I want to make today is that conflict is inevitable and that it's going to continue. And that's the result of a couple of things. You've been talking, I know, because you're in Charlie's class, a lot about economic systems, but also about political systems. Political systems and economic systems, one of the things that we do as a culture is to try and manage those conflicts that occur between groups. Talk about a little bit about the causes of conflict systemically. What causes conflict? Let me just ask you that. Why does conflict exist? Differences of opinion, okay?
Different worldviews.
Different worldviews.
Limited resources.
Limited resources. Okay, that's one of the things that I want to talk about here is the idea of limited resources. Okay. Definitions. So, the OED says the clashing or variance of opposed principles, statements, arguments, etc. Or secondly, an encounter with arms. Okay. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of conflicts that you're going to deal with. And if you want a great example of a natural resource conflict that we don't usually talk about in that context, an awful lot of what's going on in Palestine and Israel is about water. Because folks have to irrigate the crops in order to grow the food to survive there. And there's a very limited water supply. Well, here's an address you should all know from James Berry. Okay.
Who's James Berry?
Who's James Berry? You should also know who James Berry is.
He wrote Peter Pan.
He wrote Peter Pan. Okay? What's the address? Where is this place? This is Never Never Land, right? What happens in Never Never Land? You don't have to grow up, right? Things don't change. Okay? One of the basic forces that causes conflict is that people have to change, and they have to confront those changes. What's senescence mean? You have many faculty members who are becoming senescent. What's that mean? Old, okay? Systems that are changing, human culture, natural resources systems that are changing, have elements of conflict that are associated with them. Okay? We have a word for things that don't change. What is it? Dead. So, social conflict's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. If you look at the history of human culture, can you think of examples of where conflict occurred very early in culture and civilization?
I was just going to say between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens.
Yeah, between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. You can imagine, for example, over perhaps in Spain or southern France a few thousand years ago, a clan of one group gathering around a water hole, right? And here comes the other tribe up the valley, and they pick up their clubs and beat each other to death. That's a conflict over resources, over who is going to control the water and who might control the animals that were used to feed the population. Natural resources conflict, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 years old. Now, if you think about what, the way that I usually run this one is you think about what governments do. Governments have two basic functions. They provide services, they manage conflicts. Give me an example of how governments manage conflicts. Laws, okay? The legal system, one of the examples of the institutions that we use, the legal system is set up as a conflict management system. If you think about national defense, for example, that's a conflict management system. Okay? The reason that we're doing Star Wars and all the rest of this stuff, according to W at least, is that we're going to make the world safer, or we're going to eliminate conflict, or at least we're going to minimize conflict. Basically, two causes for conflicts. There's scarce resources or scarce decision authority. People struggle for power to control each other or to control their natural resources. Can you think of any other reason for conflict besides these two? I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and when I started out working in conflict and conflict management, I didn't ever think that it was really absolutely this simple, but I really have come to believe that this is the case.
I agree with the 2 points, but I think there just need to be more subsets of them. Just
Oh yeah, I mean, you can expand this forever.
Yeah.
This is just two basic principles. Yeah, that's a good point. Some examples. Now, I understand also that you've been doing a lot about American history here, so let's think about the Great Plains from Texas all the way up into Manitoba in the period about after the Civil War, let's say from 1865 until about 1885. Who owned that land? The Native Americans had a claim to that. They were obviously the indigenous people. They lived there probably for maybe 10,000 years, something like that. It evolved a pretty strong culture through the area. But when the colonial powers came through, we've already learned a little bit about Jefferson and Lewis and Clark. What was it that caused Jefferson to send Lewis and Clark to the west? It was the Louisiana Purchase, right? So the United States thought that it had bought title to all of that land from France. And so the U.S. thinks that it owns that land. The Native Americans obviously have a claim to that land. Okay? But in fact, if you went out and you looked at who actually managed that land on a day-to-day basis, who managed it? Who owned the grass?
The Great Spirit.
The Great Spirit, okay? No human effectively laid claim to that property. Let's think about this as property. Okay? And what happened after the war was that a lot of the Southern soldiers went back home to Texas. Their farms had been destroyed. They had very little left, and they gathered up the cattle that were feral cattle. What's feral mean? Wild. Okay. They gathered up the wild cattle that were down in the Rio Grande bottoms and up and through northern Sonora and northern Chihuahua, and they drove them north up into Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska and all the way up to into Manitoba. Why? There was all of that natural grazing land that was left there. Now, who owned that land? Who controlled that land? What I'm going to argue is that essentially that was called a commons. The idea of a commons is that there's a resource that's out there that's unowned. One of the major problems that we get into in terms of environmental management is that if nobody has a legitimate claim they can enforce, then everybody else comes and uses the resource. The best examples of this are the atmosphere and open ocean fisheries. No one exerts control over those, so there's no system for resource allocation there. And that's exactly what happened in the Great Plains during this period. Okay? We call this resource allocation by large caliber weapon. Okay? If you got there and you had a large revolver or a buffalo rifle and somebody else drove their herd up towards where you were grazing, you shot them. What was the conflict about there? The conflict was about control of the resources, the allocation of the grasslands to feed the cattle that they moved onto the boxcars and then shipped back east. Just a classic Western resource management conflict. And to some extent, if you go out west, you'll still see the remnants of that today. We can take a related example and think about this in terms of colonial powers, because one of the things that we don't do when we talk about cowboys, shepherds, and farmers is we don't really talk about what happened to the Native Americans. What happened to the Native Americans?
Genocide?
Genocide? Yeah, I think that's an appropriate word. Okay. How were the Native Americans eliminated in the Great Plains?
Guns, germs, and steel.
Guns, germs, and steel. Okay. Pretty much.
And starvation.
And starvation, right? If you shot all the buffalo and the culture was organized around the bison, then there wasn't anything left to eat, was there? Okay. If you gave them blankets that were infected with smallpox, that just made it go a little bit faster. Now, you'll see that same pattern in colonial systems all around the world. One of the first things that colonial governments do when they come to a new area is that they have to confront the dominant culture. Okay? And that culture allocates power and it allocates resources, and it typically does that through some kind of communal structure. This happened in Africa when the British took over Africa. It happened, of course, the Belgian and the French were also involved in this. But this is a great example of this. The first thing that you do is you destroy the dominant culture in terms of its power authority. And when that happens, that communal culture can no longer allocate resources. And the result of that is resource degradation. Modern land use conflicts. Let's talk about public lands. Give me an example of public lands in New York State.
The Adirondack Forest.
Okay, the Adirondack Park. Okay, the Adirondack Park is a great example of a public land. Now, what do we know about the Adirondack Park? Okay, it's the only piece of public property in the United States that's constitutionally protected. The Constitution of New York State actually has the Forever Wild Clause in it. That makes it unique. We don't do that with national parks or national forests, wildlife refuges, or anything else. Okay. What is it that people want from the Adirondacks? Yeah, it's 40% public and 60% private inside the blue line. Okay. So here's a great example. If you're a private landowner inside the Adirondack blue line, what you can do with your private property is very different than what you can do with your private property outside of the blue line. Why is that? Because the Adirondack Park Agency, what happened is in the 1970s, when the Adirondacks was threatened with one of its great waves of development, and these happen every 20 or 25 years, the state of New York established what they call the Adirondack Park Agency, and they wrote land use regulations for private lands inside the park. So now if you're a private landowner inside the park, you're constrained in terms of what you can do with your land. Those same constraints would not exist outside the blue line. What people want from public lands is different than what people want from private lands. And the result of that is conflict. People have different wants. They have different values for ranking wants. Everybody, if I ask you what your values are, and we had you write down your top 5 values, what we'd find out is that there'd be a fair amount of difference between each of you in terms of what you think the most important values are. So it's not just that you want different things, it's that you have different values that you use to rank those wants. The other thing that happens is that as you get older, what you want changes over time. What's most important to you when you're 20 is probably not what's most important to you when you're 60 or 70. All of those things contribute to the idea that you want different things at different times, and the result of that is conflict. In the United States, we have a system of government that we call liberal democracy. What does liberal mean? What's the base, what's the root of liberal?
Free. I think it's very free.
It's what?
Isn't it like be very free?
Yes, yeah, it's liberty, right? To be free. And what was it that we were trying to be free from? Well, from the British, but what was the British political system?
Monarchy.
From monarchy, okay? The idea in liberal democracy was that you weren't going to have a monarch, a sovereign, that was going to tell you what to do. That every individual, and this was Jefferson's great idea in the Enlightenment, based on John Locke and Montesquieu and people like that, that we were going to maximize the amount of liberty that individuals had. Jefferson wrote about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Do you remember what the first draft of that clause was?
Life, liberty, and property.
It was life, liberty, and property. Okay? And it was changed in the last draft, and it was based on John Locke. The idea was that everybody ought to be free to pursue private property, that people became happy and they became free by having access to private property. Private values and public values. What we want from the Adirondack Park in terms of watersheds and wildlife and biodiversity and all the other non-market values that Charlie likes to talk about, those are the public values. And there's a difference between private values and public values. And that's one of the roots of this basic conflict. Like I said before, every society at some point or another has to confront these problems. And generally the way that we do it is through 3 different mechanisms. A norm is a good example of where the group enforces some kind of behavior. Mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, comes from a guy named Garrett Hardin. This is what Hardin suggested was the way that we were going to resolve a lot of the resource management and environmental problems that we had, is if groups of people would come together and enforce those norms. The second one that's up here is law. Now law comes in a lot of different forms. All of these things are going to have effects on conflict management. One of the things that we're confronting a lot with lately is the Fifth Amendment, because one of the things in the Fifth Amendment says that the federal government or the government can't take your property without compensating you. So one of the problems is that when a government regulates a wetland, for example, and that means that the private person that owns the wetland can no longer develop it, they've removed most of the financial value from the parcel, and according to the Supreme Court, they get to be compensated by the group. Statutes is one of the ways that we do that. Statutes are conflict management mechanisms because they say what it's going to be. The Endangered Species Act is a great example of that. So we've got constitutional law, we've got statutory law, we've got civil law. A tort is where somebody injures somebody else, okay, and they're held liable or responsible for it. The last one I want to talk about a little bit is property and property systems. We'll talk about private property, common property, and the commons, and what the differences are between those things. Commons are unowned resources. And the best examples of commons are the atmosphere and open ocean fisheries. Common property is property that's owned by the group. Who owns the wildlife? The people of the state of New York. The government of the state of New York holds the wildlife in trust for the benefit of the people. It is a common resource. Okay? And when you have a common resource, that means that the community, the government, the tribe, the elders, whoever it is that acts as trustees for the resources, exerts control or authority over how those things are used. The last one's private property. In private property, the individual controls the resource. Syracuse University is private property. It belongs to a corporation. And in the law, we treat corporations as individuals. So your job as an environmental manager is to somehow find the balance between what all these different interest groups want. And the question is, how do you do that? Okay? When do you litigate and when do you negotiate? Litigation means suits, court suits. Okay? When do you go to court? Okay? And when do you just sit down with the people who are interested and try to make peace and get everybody to sign some kind of an agreement? The other alternative that we have is to negotiate these things. Negotiation and mediation. Negotiation is voluntary, face-to-face discussion about how you're going to resolve a particular environmental problem. Mediation, on the other hand, is voluntary, it's face-to-face, but there's a third party, a neutral person who's running the process. Okay? This is the new model. Okay? This is, if I were to make one prediction about what things are going to be different in the next 20 or 25 years during the course of your career, it's going to be that you're going to see more and more negotiation and mediation based on the idea that we can get all of the stakeholders together to come and discuss what we're going to do about an environmental problem. The idea here is that we're going to reach some kind of an agreement, and it's going to be based on consensus. And so the question, the real important question that I want to leave you with is, when do you litigate and when do you negotiate? Okay? Because sometimes you're going to have to do one or the other. Sometimes you're going to do both.